Okay, good morning, everyone. I have, I don't even know. I'm really groggy. My brain's not functioning. Um, I have to do reading today, so my goal is to try and get through 2 books today. And I have to go to Officeworks to go buy that calculator. And if I'm still feeling energy, I'm gonna go into Bayside and look for some bed sheets. But if not, I'm gonna wait. Um, but yeah, that's me. And yeah. Don't stay up till 4 a.m., kids. Do not recommend it. It's not a good plan. Money may try and convince you that it is. This is with your sleep schedule. And you just get very, very groggy in the morning. Wish me luck with the reading. Okay, so it's now 1:30 and I've officially started White Fragility. I'm only up to page 3, but in my defense, I did read the author's note at the beginning, which was like 3 pages. And something I forgot about this book is while it is small AF, the writing font size is also small AF. Look, it's tiny, minuscule. So that's gonna add to it. I don't like it when the writing is that small. I like having big text. That's why I keep buying the illustrated editions for A Game of Thrones, because that gives me the big text. Because I've picked up like A Feast of Crows to look at it, and the writing is so small, and that's just gonna do my nuttin'. I need the big text. But I'm enjoying it, and something I enjoyed in her author's note is she brought up multicultural kids, and I was just like, thank you for doing that, because multicultural is more than if your parents come from 2 different races. It's more than that. It's also just being brought up in a different culture. And when I'd hang out with my fellow missionary kids, we got called third culture kids because our parents are from one culture, and in my case, 2 very different cultures, because my dad is Australian and my mum is Scottish. And people, you're probably like, but you're both white, that should be the same, and it's really not. They're very different. And I was brought up in Tanzania, which is another culture. And so when you combine 3 different cultures together, you get a third culture kid. And that's often what happens with missionary kids. Because we get brought up on an entirely different continent to where our parents came from. Like, I knew missionary kids who spent just about their entire childhood in a completely different continent to where their parents grew up. So, like, there was a group of missionary kids, like, it was an entire family, and they were there out in Chile, in South America, for like 30 years. So their kids just spent their entire childhood growing up in Chile. So when you come back to places like Australia, you go through massive culture shock because you did not grow up in this culture. Like, I left Australia when I was 5. We went away for 3 months. It might have been 6 months. For my dad was taking place, filling in for someone who was on sabbatical here in Australia. And then after that, my parents decided we're moving back there permanently. So I moved back there when I was 6. So I didn't have that many memories of Australia. And then we'd come back, and what happens when you're a missionary is you'll stay in the country for 3 years, then you'll come back for 6 months, and then you'll go back again for another 3 years until you feel like you need to retire. So I was there with my parents for 10 years. And I only came back for 6 months once. The second time my parents went back for 6 months, I was at boarding school, so I only came back for a month, and then I went back to boarding school. So when we came back here when I was 16 to live here permanently, I went through massive culture shock. Because this isn't what I was raised in. And I'm enjoying that she brought that up, because I'm like, thank you. I did grow up in a completely different culture. That's why I think I find the topic of systemic racism so hard, because I grew up in Tanzania, East Africa. I was the minority. And I hate seeing that this is a problem today. I should have been solved centuries ago. Why do white people have such a big high horse? We're not great. We're not wonderful. We're really not. Anyway, you're gonna get a lot of this rants with this because I'm reading this, so it's gonna bring up all of my rants. Alright. Talk to you guys later. Okay, so it is freezing right now, and I'm trying valiantly to stay awake. My body's wanting to go to sleep. But I did get some reading done today. I have downloaded the book for the audiobook for White Fragility, and I listened to it as I walked, and probably would have gotten more done if I hadn't spoken to my best friend on the road, but I did, so allow. Anyway, so I've got to the second chapter of the audiobook. There's like 6 hours in this audiobook, and it's a tiny book. I'm like, how is this 6 hours? But okay, the voice is soothing. So I'll probably try and listen to some more of that tonight. I am enjoying it. It is going a lot into like philosophical stuff, and it's really getting me to think about my actions and how they affect people, which is what I wanted. Because I like to think that I'm not at all racist and I'm not keeping up with the systemic racism in this country, or just in general. But for all now, I am. So that's why I'm reading this book, because I want to make sure that I'm not. I think I might be a little bit. Just because you never should stop. You should never say, I've achieved, I'm no longer contributing to the systemic racism. No, never do that, because the minute you do that, you start contributing to it again. You just gotta keep thinking about it and keep working at it. It's an ongoing process. It never stops. That's one of the key things I'm learning with this. So. I think the reason why this is going a lot slower is, like I said, it's a factual book, and I generally don't read those for fun. I find them very boring and very dull. So this is going to be a challenge for me. Tomorrow I'm going to read my comic book by the window, and that will be my reading outside. And we'll see how far I've gotten with the rest. But hopefully I will at least get 4 out of my 5 books done. And I will be very impressed by that, because even though I read nothing on Friday, I've had a pretty good system going with my reading, despite having to do it while I've got assessments going on. And I do have a calculations exam on Monday, so I'm going to have to do revision for that at some point tomorrow. So I think I've done very well, considering, for me, the reading rush fell at a really bad time. I would have been so much happier if it had fallen last week or the week before. But it fell this week. So. Unless we go into stage 4 lockdown, then I don't have to worry about the calculations. But they would have told us already if that was going to happen for next week. So. But yeah. I have been doing some reading today. I promise. And it hasn't just been fanfiction. She does have a very nice... I really loved whoever they got to read the audiobook. She has a lovely voice. Like, it's an American voice, but it's very soothing. Anyway, I'll get back to you on this in a bit. Okay. Thanks, guys. Okay, so I managed to get up to chapter 4 of the book without realizing it, because on Audible, sometimes with the books they weren't announced when they changed the chapter, so I just genuinely don't notice. And they've got onto this section where they're talking about the subject of when you're a white person and you're born in the Western society, you have an innate sense of belonging. Your teachers will generally be white. Even at the hospital where you were born, probably most of the medical staff who helped you were white. And that sort of thing. And she goes on to say how she hasn't experienced being a racial minority. And I'm like, well, I do agree with this sense of belonging, because I definitely must have had it. I differ with that one, because since I grew up in Africa for 10 years, I was the racial minority. And she goes on in it to say how a lot of people feel a sense of anxiety when they go into a crowd of black people. And I remember when I first came back, I was feeling more anxiety by the fact that there were more white people than black people. I was bewildered by the amount of white people at my school. There was like one kid in my class who was black, and I kept going up to talk to him because I was so baffled by the lack of black people. Because where I grew up, I was surrounded. I was very much the minority. Yes, I had white friends. I'm not going to lie. I definitely had white friends. But equally, I had friends who were black. And at boarding school, I've said this in other videos, I was one of 6 in a class of 72 who were white. A couple were of Indian descent, and the rest were black. So majority of my friends at that school were black. Like, in all honesty, I can say I formed closer bonds with my black friends and the people of Indian descent than I ever did with any of my fellow whites in that school. So when I came here, and there were no black people, or very little, I felt a great sense of unease. And even now, and I've been back in Australia for almost 8 years now, I realized, which is rather scary, I still feel that. I still instinctively look for the black people in the room to go and talk to them and get to know them. Like, I got really excited with my nursing course because one of my teachers was black and she was from Zimbabwe, and I've been to Zimbabwe. I got really excited talking to her about it. Or when I was on placement, I spoke to someone there who was from Zimbabwe, and she got really surprised because I knew a lot about it because I'd been there before on a family holiday, and I'd lived in Tanzania, and I greeted her in Swahili, and she didn't know very much because she grew up speaking English. But I could see the innate sense of joy in finding someone who had been there before. And that's what I always do when I go on those it's something this book has made me realize. I instinctively look for the black people in the room and gravitate towards them. The only other type of people I'd say I'd gravitate towards is if they're inherently geeky or if they're a Christian. I will gravitate towards that person. That is generally what I do. I will go and talk to them. It's an interesting thing to realize that that's what I inherently do. I go instinctively to find the black person in the room. It also makes me think there's not as many black people in Australia as there are in America. We've got Indigenous instead, which is awesome. And yeah, that's awesome. I'm really happy, but I'm not saying we don't have any. We definitely do. Maybe I'm not going to the right places. There's a possibility. That was a random ramble. I'm going to get back to the book. Okay, finally up to chapter 5, and at the end of chapter 4, I just have to say this again, and I feel like I'm playing into the stereotypes that she talks about in this, because it's like, am I getting defensive? Because she says when white people get accused of being racist, we get defensive, and that makes sense. And I'm like, am I being defensive, or am I just finding this interesting? Because she says that, at least in America, I don't know about here, it could be quite possible here, actually, now that I think on it. Yeah, definitely. That people aren't encouraged, like, if you grow up in, like, the upper middle class, you'll generally just be surrounded by white people. And if you grow up in the low socioeconomic, then yes, you may make friends cross-cultural. But you're not encouraged to keep those friends. And so people growing up in the upper class aren't really aware of other races outside of like TV or controlled propaganda. And I was thinking back on my childhood before I moved to Africa. And one of my clearest memories is the baby born fad. Everyone had to have a baby born. Everyone. So when I asked my mum for a baby born, she went out of her way to find me a black baby born. So my baby born was black, not white. And I wish we kept that doll, but we left it in Africa with some dear friends for them to play with because they didn't have dolls. It went to a good cause. But I do miss that baby born. But I was trying to think if I was kept separated from races before we went to Africa. And while I don't think I grew up in a predominantly cross-cultural area, my parents constantly talked to me about their time in Africa or about the friends they'd made. And I remember there was a series of books that we read. The Jungle Book, where the main characters, I think it was the Jungle Book, it might have been something else, but the main characters were black. And so from an early age, my parents ensured that I knew about all the different races. And that... I don't feel like I'm explaining this very well, but I just wanted to bring up that point. And since I went to Africa for 3 months when I was 5, and then I moved there permanently when I was 6. And left when I was 16. That meant I spent the majority of my childhood in Africa. So, yeah. It's interesting reading this book. Now, obviously it's talking predominantly about America. It's making me weep for America right now. But I can apply certain things she's saying about the African Americans to the indigenous people we have here. Like the inherent stereotypes that they're going to get in trouble or in areas where the indigenous people live are unsafe. I believe we have those same stereotypes here. We've got to change this. And we've got to integrate our societies more without the indigenous people risking losing their culture. That's a bit of a catch-22 there, because we want to integrate them in our society so that we grow up side by side with one another, but I don't want them to lose their cultural heritage any more than they already have. And if we integrate them in our society completely, then they'll have lost it. Because Western society will say that their cultural beliefs have no place here. They do, but Western society will say it doesn't. So what we need to do is to create a Western society that allows for their cultural beliefs to flourish while working side by side with us. And I think that's going to take 500 years at this rate to complete, which is very sad when you think about it. I warned you this was going to happen when I listened to this book. I warned you. Okay, so this is going to be the last video of the night. It is almost 20 to 1. So I really need to sleep and do my Pilates and just go to bed. But I've made fantastic progress today in my book. I have 2.5 hours left in the audiobook, and in the actual book I have gotten up to page 87. Which may not seem like a lot, but in total the number of hours in this book is 6 hours. That means I've listened to this book for over 4 hours. No, it's 6 hours something. I've listened to it for over 4 hours, I promise. And honestly, it's got me questioning myself. And that's exactly what I wanted. Because the last thing I want to do is to participate in systemic racism. And this author is wonderful, okay? So she brings up a question in it. That's something that I've said in this very video that I've done. Is I was the minority at my school. So I was the one that experienced racism. What she says here is, white settler nations, only white people are in the position to oppress people of colour collectively and throughout the whole of the society. So, when I was in Africa, I wasn't in a white settler nation, so it's a little bit different. When I came back here, I immediately entered back into that society. And and this is something I actually said, while a white person may have been picked on, even mercilessly, by being in the numerical minority in a specific context, the individual was experiencing race prejudice and discrimination, not racism. So what I experienced at boarding school, which I always put under the classification of racism, by this definition was not racism, but racial prejudice and discrimination. And something they brought up, and this could have possibly been true or not true, I don't know. But it is likely that the white students at such a school were treated better by teachers, and that higher expectations were held for them. I was told by a teacher after we did an IQ test, why was I still in the bottom set? Because apparently I was intelligent enough to be in the top set. But I clearly was not using my brain power accurately. And these students were still granted white privilege as they moved through society. That could be true or not true, depending on how you look at the situation in Africa. But it is true that the minute I stepped back on Australian soil, there was no question of whether I'd be allowed back in. I was born here. I have my Australian passport and my Australian birth certificate, and I was white. The fact that I lived in Africa for 10 years doesn't mean I was going to get put in quarantine for a bit. I'd immediately be accepted back in with open arms. So, I find that fascinating because it challenges something that I've mentioned in videos, and now I've got to think on it. Because I'm like, yes, I experienced being the minority when I lived in Africa. But the point is, I'm not experiencing it now. I'm experiencing the full benefit of white privilege here in Australia. And so now I need to make sure that I fight against it and ensure that everyone has privilege. And something else I said is like, my parents were not racist and they taught me not to be racist. A racism-free upbringing is not possible because racism is a social system embedded into the culture and its institutions. So I think what she's saying here is, well, the parents may do their best to do that. The rest of the outside environment that the child is being brought up in will fight against it. And it would just mean that the person is uneducated about the socialization process and the inescapable dynamics of human culture. We can't teach humans to have no prejudice at all. The human brain just does not work that way, as we process information about others. So, God teaches us not to judge. But humanity does this naturally. We automatically classify people. We make judgments about them. What we have to try and do is make sure those judgments that we make automatically in our brain do not influence us as we treat other people. I have made a solemn vow to myself when I started this nursing course that I would never treat anyone different no matter where they come from. But in this one, it's bringing into us, like, race has nothing to do with it. Race has everything to do with it. When I say I'm not going to treat anyone differently, I mean I'm going to give them the same medical treatment. But for instance, if I'm treating someone who's Muslim and they're wearing a hijab, in their culture, if I'm remembering correctly, and if I'm wrong, I'm sorry, they're not allowed to be touched by males that are not part of their family. So I would have to perform the treatments and ensure that this patient gets a female doctor. Or another instance could be the Jehovah's Witness don't believe in blood transfusion. It goes against their religion. So I would have to look into alternative methods in order to help my patient. So while I say I won't treat anyone differently, I will embrace their culture and try and treat them to the best of my capabilities while not harming their culture or degrading it. That is a part of who they are, and I'm going to have to embrace it, even when it doesn't make sense to me, because that is who they are. And I can't condemn them for that. I'll just have to look for a different method to treat them. And something she kept bringing up is we must be careful not to use them to keep ourselves on the good side of the false binary. There's a good and bad binary. So bad is when people are openly racist. And good is when people don't talk about it, but that doesn't mean they aren't racist. You have to try and not fall into that trap. And this is what she finishes the chapter with. I am not in a fixed position on the continuum. My position is dictated by what I am actually doing at a given time. Conceptualizing myself on an active continuum changes the question from whether I am or I am not a racist to a much more constructive question. Am I actively seeking to interrupt racism in this context? And perhaps even more importantly, how do I know? So, I'm going to try and take on board these lessons. Am I actively not allowing racism to happen in this context? Am I fighting against it? Am I speaking up? But see, this is why I wanted to read this book, is getting me to think, am I doing these things? Or am I looking for reasons to justify why I couldn't possibly be a racist, and yet I'm helping in the systemic racism of our society? I need to find an Australian one. Because it keeps bringing up, like, the 1930 Civil Rights Act, and I'm like, no, that didn't happen here with the 2005 when they finally got basic human rights. The Indigenous people, that is. Okay, I'm going to end this video here. But yeah, if you enjoyed, like, leave a comment, maybe even subscribe if you want to. Or if this is Instagram, just leave a like. And I really hope you enjoyed my really random babbling. Night, guys.